right, I'm really excited. So today's guest is Sam Newsome. Now, Sam Newsome is a saxophonist. He's an educator and an author. He's been on our podcast before. He was featured in episode 106. And I did a review of his book, Be Inspired, Stay Focused. I'm going to put both of those links in the show notes, folks. For those of you that are watching this on YouTube or are listening in your car or wherever you're going, working out, you're listening to the podcast, you'll definitely get access to those links. So, Sam, welcome back to the podcast.
Well, it's great to be back, and I can't thank you enough for your support. I mean, it's like you've just been overly generous with your time, so I really appreciate it.
Oh, please. Are you kidding? You're such an amazing player, a visionary. And, like I said in my book review, that Be Inspired, Be Focused book, that everybody should be reading that. And this is like, perfect time of the year, January 2024. That book really opened my eyes to a lot of things. So, again, I'm going to encourage people to watch that review and get the book for sure. But no, absolutely. And the cool thing, what we're going to talk about today is another thing that just totally blew my mind. And it's your release, Cosmic Unconsciousness Unplugged. Cosmic Unconsciousness Unplugged. That's a little bit of a mouthful, but still, it's an incredible work of art. And the idea behind this, I want to start off by reading something that you have on your Bandcamp site, which is where people can buy this. And it's essentially this. Zen teacher Suzuki said, "In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert mind, there are few." He wasn't cautioning against expertise or learning, but encouraging his students to approach each moment as if it were brand new. Now, I'm starting off this way because, and we're going to talk about the inspiration for this album, but we had just done some Facebook correspondence, and I said, how on earth did you do this? How on earth did you create this album? And everything just was in sync. It's stunning to me. So with the approach of being in the beginner's mind and encouraging his students to approach each moment as if we were brand new, can you talk about the inspiration for this album?
Well, it really was just about getting together with John Michel and continuing the work that we started when we recorded our recording Magic Circle. And we don't really play together a lot, but when we do come together, it's always something special. Well, since that recording, I can't remember the exact date, maybe it was like released in 2017, I know I have undergone just a lot of changes. I had since added the prepared saxophone component to my playing, and of course, he's always evolving as an artist. So I really wanted to see where we're at that particular moment that we recorded. So it wasn't really any particular agenda other than, again, let's just continuing to have our musical conversation and see what unfolds as a result.
And let me ask you more about that though, because if I remember right, you didn't like rehearse,
No.
You just, did you know the songs you were going to do?
I just sort of, any standards that we went into, it was, none of them were ever discussed. I'm probably more confident going into a standard without any notice and knowing that he's going to be there than the shoe being on the other foot. His repertoire of jazz standards is a lot more vast than mine, but I knew whatever I went into, it was going to be something that he knew and would pick up on, right away. So there was nothing really discussed. In fact, when we were driving to the recording site, we didn't even really talk about music at all. We were just kind of talking about life in general. And then once we got to the recording studio, we just sort of, put on the headphones and had Matt Bellitt-Sayers, who's the producer, hit the record button. We just sort of let happen what was going to happen.
Wow. That still is blowing my mind. And Okay, so I can understand the standards. Like you have standards like Take the A Train. I want to dive into
Yeah,
that in a minute. All the
yeah.
things you are, Solitude, that kind of thing. But there's other songs on here that are not standards. So,
Mhm.
how did you approach those?
Um, I wish I had an answer for you. I mean, a lot of times, I would start an idea and then he would just react to what I played, and then that would sort of set the tone of sort of where the tune was going to go. And sometimes things would go in a direction that I was not anticipating, and I would have to adjust. And that's the thing about playing with John Michel is like he never does what I hope that he would do, and he never goes to where I think he's going to go. So I'm always forced to go into whatever the idea that we're exploring, with a certain amount of flexibility, because I know whatever's there or whatever we're arriving at, at that moment, it's only temporary. It's just gonna go to wherever, you know, collectively we decide it's going to go.
And that, in all honesty, I mean, we've had periods in jazz history of free improvisation, but
Hmm.
almost in this sense, this is again free improvisation.
Yeah, yeah, it really is. I guess um, my understanding of improvisation, the way it was taught to me in grade school was that improvisation was a spontaneous creation of a melody. But I think we've taken it a step further, where improvisation is a spontaneous creation of a composition.
Yeah, like a conversation,
Yeah,
exactly like a conversation, and again, like I like to make my podcast like that. I think about some areas I want to cover, but half the time we don't get there because we're talking about something else that's just really cool, and
yeah,
which is what we're kind of doing right now. Um, and
yeah.
it's interesting too. Let me ask you this question too, because there's a lot of people that listen to the podcast that, want to improvise and they feel like, it's such a mountain to climb and they look at what you do and they think, I'll never be able to do that. How is he doing that? How can I do that? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I think we all are improvisers. I mean, just from the fact that you can have a conversation, the fact that you can, you know, navigate your way through life. I mean, you're constantly having to improvise, and so I think what I've done, and certainly what John Michel does, we sort of do what we do in life just sort of through the, you might say, the lens of music. So I mean, if there are any students out there who feel that going on stage with no agenda other than just to get out of the way of the music, is beyond them. That's not accurate. It's like it's a matter of just trusting yourself and trusting the musician that you are playing with, because sometimes what unfolds in some instances is a lot more interesting or profound than what you can set out to play. So I tend not to argue with the greater forces. Because I mean, there have been numerous times it's like I've gone into the recording studio, even when playing over standard tunes, where I felt I would have like an agenda, but then I would get into the studio, or we get in, we start to tune off, and things don't go how I planned for them to go, and so I would get frustrated, and then you get this internal dialogue happening, and you're questioning yourself, and the, I guess what I call them ants, automatic negative thoughts. They start to to take over the situation, and then what could have been a beautiful moment ends up being something very negative. Not because of the music, but because of how you reacted to the situation. So that's what I'm always trying to remind myself, and that's what this particular situation reminds me of, at least with John Michel. And actually, that's not true, not just with him. Most of the performances that I do, I would say 90% of the gigs that I do are totally improvised. But I was telling someone recently that at this stage in my life, I probably practice standards more than I ever have in my life. And the reason being, I rarely get to play them. So I'm a little bit paranoid that I'm going to lose the ability to play traditional jazz because I rarely get to do it. And not even play traditional jazz. I rarely get to play gigs where I'm reading charts, so I'm actually always brushing up on those skills. So what has actually happened is I think my traditional plan has gotten stronger because I actually work on it a lot more. And I think even my creative, I guess more improvised experimental playing has grown because I'm actually honing this concrete information, this concrete language that I can bring to the more improvised and experimental situation. So it seems to be, they seem to help or fuel each other.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack here. This was really profound, in all honesty. So let me ask you this question: you feel like you're working on standards more than you ever have.
Yeah.
Two, how are you working on the standards now that's different than, let's say, 5 or 10 years ago? What's your approach?
Well, what's interesting is when I'm practicing the standards, I'm less concerned with innovation. I'm less concerned with being hip. I really just focus on the fundamentals. Like if you were to hear me practice, you would probably think that I was like some young student at the new school, just learning his or her two fives, because that's how I practice. I mean, it's like really just very basic stuff. So because I guess I'm learning that, you know, I'm, I don't know things as well as I thought that I did. I've always been inspired by the Kenny Werner uh, analogy of associating levels of knowing with certain colors. I may have talked about this before, but he identified them as three different colors. There's black, there's gray, and there is white. So he said white is pretty simple. When you know something at the white level, that's pretty simple because that just means you don't know it at all. But then there's the black level, which is what he describes as all knowing. That is something that you know so well that you have it mastered. And as he says, you know it so well that not only do you always play it correctly, but you cannot play it wrong or play it incorrectly. But then he says there's the gray area. And he says that this is where, you kind of know something, but maybe it's not as tight or as strong as it should be. And so, like you might know a particular pattern, maybe you know it in 10 out of the 12 keys, or maybe you know part of it, or maybe there's a tune that but then, maybe a little shaky on the bridge, and maybe there are a couple of chord changes you don't really know. So he said most people, their level of knowing is within the gray. And so what I try to focus on is really what I call a in-house, really kind of sonic cleansing, where I try to take all of these things that are in the gray and I try to move them to the black. And sometimes the only way that I can move them to the black is by simplifying them. And so like just having a basic, whatever, minor 725, where I think I might know it really well, but I'm like, well, can I play it in half steps? Can I play it through the cycle of fourths? Can I play it, in minor thirds? Can I play it, in tritone? So I'm always, can I play it with different inversion? So I'm always, looking at these very basic things, from a perspective of, okay, how can I master this thing that's in the gray area of knowing, of learning, and move it to the black? So I guess to answer your question of how my playing differs, I guess how do I approach standards differently now? I I think I'm more patient with the very simple in basic material, the very basic language. I'm not concerned so much with the upper extensions and the substitutions and the hit licks. That sometimes saxophonists, particularly tenor players, gravitate towards. Maybe the hip kind of Coltrane licks, or the Michael Brecker, or the Dave, those kind of Dave Lieben, Steve Grossman post Coltrane vocabulary. It's like
Yeah.
I'm kind of steering away from that and just really just playing just like basic 2/5s, triads, basic bebop scale, the blues scale. It's amazing. I still discover a lot of possibilities within that very basic language, and by mastering that very basic language, it actually gives me the I think the facility to be able to make it more complicated or sophisticated if I want to, because then I can have these. The way I think of it is like they're very these sort of these very basic musical concepts. I chain them together, or almost sort of bead them together into this kind of more complicated or complex tapestry, of ideas that's made up of very simple ideas. Because if you look at a necklace, a lot of times what forms the necklace is something very simple. It's just a bead, it's nothing. But when you put it together, then it's like, oh, wow, that's a very beautiful piece. So that's how I approach improvisation. It's just something, take these very simple nuggets of information and you just, weave them together.
Okay, thank you for that answer. And I want to dive a little deeper into this too, for my own curiosity, but also I think for the listeners as well. So when you say like let's say you're working on a minor 2/5, right? Are you are you working on, how do I, like, what I mean by patterns, I mean like, standard patterns that would be like in the Jerry Coker book, or are you creating your own patterns to work through, like you're actually, in a sense, you're improvising, you're creating a pattern that you like, and you're like, you know what, I like this one. Let me work this through all the keys. Like, how are you doing it? Or you just randomly, how are you working on a chord?
It would be a combination of both. It would be maybe that standard like Jerry Coker pattern, and then maybe that will maybe evolve into something, more personal, where I sort of put my own spin on it, and then I might take that and move it through the keys. Or sometimes I'll just use the Jerry Coker pattern and just see how that works. Sometimes I will just spend time practicing one 1, 2, 3, 5 patterns, using major, minor, diminished, and augmented. Just sometimes I realize, wow, I don't know this as well as I thought I did. So yeah, so just doing those things, I think my fundamentals are so much stronger. It's very interesting.
Yeah, you're building the foundation of a house, and
Yeah.
I think for a lot of people feel that building the foundation of the house is boring, but I think the greatest masters, and I don't care if it's music, I don't care if it's marketing, business, whatever, they always go back to the fundamentals. They're
Yeah.
always like that first quote that I read about the beginner's mind. They approach the fundamentals with that beginner's mind. Do you feel like you kind of do that?
Yeah, in some ways. Yeah, I mean, only because the reason I say that is because I don't really have this big overarching agenda. It's just like I'm really just enjoying, you know, the the act or the process of of, of honing and trying to learn those things on a deeper level. It's never, oh well, let me just get to this, 1, 2, 3, 5 pattern so I can get to something hipper. I mean, to me, at that moment, that is the hippest thing that I could be playing. And then, and I discover ways to make it more hip. I mean, or at least more sophisticated. So yeah, so it's I look at it as just really these little tiny nuggets of information that I'm able to just you know string together.
You know what pops into my mind where as you're talking about this, I think about how you were mentioning like, sometimes just triads. And it's so interesting because when you start to get involved with not only seventh chords, but ninths, 11ths, 13ths, the extensions, and also doing the hip stuff, sometimes it's really hard to just deal with triads. You know,
Yeah, yeah,
it's,
yeah,
it's, I'll never forget what Gary Burton said to me. He said, jazz is about limits, you know? And the thing is that sometimes when you have too many choices, it's overwhelming. But
yeah,
the thing though is that when you're limited to triads and we could talk about pop music and stuff like that where sometimes it is just triads,
yeah,
or open fifths or whatever, you have to you have to be that kid in the sandbox that doesn't have any tools, that has to be really creative, to come up with ways to make it interesting.
yeah, yeah. And also, I think there's just a lot of clarity, when you play triads. It's something that's very identifiable, and I think that's good when you're playing, when you're improvising. That not everything needs to be ambiguous. Because there can be a tendency with improvisers, particularly jazz improvisers. Like they oftentimes hate the obvious. It's just like, oh, I don't want people to know where the one is. I don't want to, don't play roots. It's like there are all this list of do's and don'ts, but a lot of times it's like, okay, well, let's not do anything that's obvious. And then sometimes I think it's good to do things that are obvious. I think it helps for you to lay your foundation down, and then also I think it's okay if people listening can follow. It's not the badge of honor. It's not always in losing everyone. you know.
That's awesome. Well, let me go back to the other question that I had from before. Okay, so you've not worked with Jean-Michel that much, and yet you were able to put forth this album, this freely improvised album, and yet you haven't worked together so much. And the reason why I'm stressing this is because I think about a sports analogy, and I'm going to go back to the 1986 Mets. Yes, the New York Mets. I'm originally from New York. That was my team, but this was a team of scrappy players. You had a couple of stars like Dal Strawberry, Gary Carter, Ray Knight, Keith Hernandez, but still a lot of young, scrappy players. But the thing is that they were able to gel together like a team, and like you could have a sports team of the greatest players, but they will probably not gel,
Yeah,
but you get a sports team of scrappy players, who can relate to each other, they're going to gel. I guess my question is that, maybe this is a situation for you guys where you just gel together, where you may not work together a lot, but you just gel.
yeah. Well, it's interesting because now that we've recorded this, we've made this recording. I'm a little worried about when we play, because we're going to be playing at Mesro on, I think, February 16th, because he's going to be coming to New York at that time. And just because we had such a great vibe on the recording, I have to remind myself not to try to recreate anything that we were able to get to on that recording, because that's just gonna make both of us very frustrated. So I have to, you know, go into the, the mindset of, okay, that recording was what it was, but what we're gonna do, you know, on the next gig has to be something totally different. So that, I think that's going to be the most frustrating thing. And yeah, I have to say, like the times that we have played together where it did not work was probably after we had just released a recording and then we had a gig afterwards, because we had this representation of everything gelling, so we sort of went against what actually allowed us to make the great recording.
Oh,
So yeah, so I'm as we were talking about this, I was like, yeah, I need to just kind of make a mental note to not to try to get to anything that we did on the recording. Like, don't play any of the standards. Don't try to recreate any of the spontaneous compositions that we got to. It had to be really just a whole new repertoire of material.
oh, okay. So this is really interesting. So
Yeah.
when you do that show, are you saying that you're not going to use and I'm looking, by the way, everybody, I'm looking, if you're watching the video, I'm looking at the Bandcamp thing. I'm going to share this in a minute. I'm looking at like the songs that are on here. So are you saying that you're not going to do any of those songs, or you're going to do totally different songs, and approach it as if this is like, let's say, another recording date and stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, I would be surprised if we play any of the songs that we played on the
Wow.
record. Because with the exception of the standards that we played, all of those compositions were all improvised. So we're going to have to, I mean, we'll just, again, let the music sort of dictate the situation. And so that's going to be, I think, the most difficult part, you know, because it's easier to let to sort of paint on a blank canvas when it really is blank. But as when you perceive something as being there, then it becomes a lot more difficult to go into that mindset. And I guess as far as perceiving something as being there, meaning whatever ideas that we like from the recording, that we were thinking, oh well, this was a great moment. Let's try to do this on the gig. Chances are, it won't be as good as it was on the recording, and we'll probably deny ourselves, the pleasure of discovering something new.
Okay, this
Yeah.
brings up a few other things too. So, is it safe to say that that recording, that moment in time, and this is true for anybody, anything, folks, but that moment in time, like people, okay, so Miles Davis will go into a recording studio, they'll record So What? There'll be number of takes and that kind of thing. The melody will be there, the guts of the song, the head of the song will be there. It's just the improvisations will be different and that kind of thing. But in your situation, it's not even that the head of the melody is there. It's like that moment won't be able to be recreated
Correct.
again. Are you comfortable with that? Knowing that you won't be able to recreate that again.
I mean, I have to sort of accept the fact that when we come together, that what we create, at Mesro may not be as good. I'm not sure. It may, in some situations, some instances, it might be a little better, or some it may be worse. So we just have to accept it for what it is. I mean, we've all been in situations where we go into the recording studio, and we do take after take after take, and it just gets progressively worse.
Yeah.
You're like, we should have just gone with the first take.
Yeah.
So we're doing this sort of on another level, where it's just like, well, instead of trying to recreating a moment, just we have to let that moment be, what it is. It's like like we're getting to moments during this podcast. I mean, if we did take two, it would be very uncomfortable, because, right now we're in the moment. We don't really have too much of an agenda. We're just sort of, letting the ideas flow. But if you said, okay, that was good, let's try a couple more, you know, uh, hours and see if we can get it better. It won't, it maybe in some instances, maybe we might get into a back and forth that might be a little smoother, but probably the overall, performance of the overall conversation, overall dialogue probably won't be as good or as authentic as it was during the time when we're all just discovering it for the first time.
The
Yeah,
flow. Yeah, the flow will be interrupted.
yeah, yeah. So with so when I'm playing with him, it's really just letting that moment in time be what it was, and just just be thankful that we were able to document it and release it, into the world, and then just kind of have to move on. I
With your
guess
with your show coming up, are you going to document that too? Are you going to record that?
I'm not sure. I mean, I'm toying with the idea, because I mean there have been times, because usually most times when we come together, it's always something special. Like there's rarely been a time where it's like we just didn't get into that zone. So I might see if I can get someone to come and make a recording of it. It might be interesting to actually do two sets of it, and see what unfolds.
Let me, oh gosh, I have so many questions. Let me ask this question too. Do you find, and this, because you're also an educator, you're a teacher as well. And maybe you've talked about this, you broached the subject with your students, but also in your own mindset too. When you know you're going to be recording, okay, whether in
Mm.
your recording studio or you're at a live gig, right, and you're recording it, does that affect your mindset? Does that change your approach, or are you able to disassociate with that and just be able to, you know, do what you need to do, so to speak?
Does it change, like leading up? Does it affect my behavior leading up to that, or you're saying
In the
the
moment?
things change when I'm in the studio?
Yeah, it would be, behavior in the moment. So like when you're either in the studio or you're on that stage and it's being recorded. Does your mindset change? Do you have a different approach? Are there extra nerves?
Yeah. Well, if I'm on stage, that's a different situation, because the fact that it's being recorded is not so in your face. Like there are no like there's nothing about the situation that's different, than if it's not being recorded. Whereas when you're in the studio, it's like you have on the headphones, you're in this weird position, you know, sometimes you're in a booth, you're in this very unnatural playing situation. So in that type of situation, it's hard not to maybe to be a little less reserved, or just feeling uneasy. But what has helped me, is that I record myself so much that, now when I go into the recording studio, it's not that big of a deal. It's just okay. I record myself. Every time I practice, and sometimes I video tape myself, and so I'm. It's not that big a deal. I'm learning how to sort of shut down that level of anxiety that you sort of get hit with when it's like, okay, when someone says, okay, we're recording, and then immediately you kind of tighten up. So that doesn't happen as much, and I attribute some of it to me just being more experienced, and I think some of it is also that I'm recording myself all the time. It's just like, I always tell students, it's just like you should constantly record yourself. There's a very brutal, honest truth there that you just have to deal with. You can run from it and pretend it doesn't exist, but it's like it's there. It's just like when you're getting ready in the morning, to go out to work or to a gig, or just to go out into the public. It could be easier to stand far away from the mirror and not really deal with what you need to deal with. But sometimes you just have to get right up on that mirror.
Yeah, because the recording doesn't lie, and
Yeah.
but what's interesting too. And when I interviewed Victor Goines, and he said something that it just didn't occur to me. for you and I growing up, we're used to a live audience. That's a
Yeah, yeah,
performance. But kids growing up today, a performance is bringing out the phone and being on TikTok and YouTube.
yeah,
And and I know this sounds stupid because it's so obvious, but it was like that just kind of hit me. I was like, that's really weird. That's really weird for me. And the thing is that I'm wondering too, probably because you record yourself all the time, but I feel like, a live audience, it's that energy that I
yeah,
react to. It's really hard to bring forth that energy when you're staring at a camera. You
yeah,
know,
yeah.
do you have any tips for that?
Um, well, I think, when you're staring at a camera, it's not necessary, because when when you're recording in a studio or you're recording, yourself, whether maybe it's on your computer camera or your from your phone, it's a much more intimate playing or recording situation. So it's so you there are nuances that you're able to deal with or to tap into, when you're recording that maybe you can't when you're playing live. So I don't necessarily think you need to try to have the same energy when you're recording, I guess in a more controlled setting than you would if you were on stage. If I was maybe on a big stage and someone would say, "Hey, we're going to make a live recording," it's like literally, I don't have to think differently. There's nothing. There's no altering my musical behavior in any way. But certainly in the recording studio, I don't need to turn it up to 10. I think maybe turning it up to 5 can be enough for that particular situation. Because the music, the sound doesn't have to travel as far. My access to the sound of the other musicians, is more accessible. So there's less energy needs to be exerted. So I think it's good to keep that sort of maybe more nuanced subtlety within the music and not try to make it as though you're playing on this big stage and there are hundreds of people in the audience and you're trying to scream and reach the person in the top balcony. You don't that's not necessary. And whenever I hear recording where people are playing that way, it sounds very unnatural. Like when I hear them, you know, uh, maybe I guess there's a term called burnout, where they're just playing this burnout style, in the recording studio. It doesn't feel natural. But to hear it live, yes, that's you're responding to the energy of each other. You're responding to the energy of the crowd, and it just sort of the music sort of takes on this liveliness that it should have in a live situation, but it's not necessary. I think in a more intimate recording situation. In fact, that's why I like making studio recordings because I can get to just more vulnerable moments that don't translate well live, because I mean, I one of the frustrations I have with playing live is, especially with other musicians, like, what I mean, like when you, so like a conventional rhythm section, like sometimes they get excited about some of the sounds that I make and they overplay. And so like what I'm actually trying to get to this, the subtleties of it gets lost. And so I have to always say, okay, this isn't going to work. And what I'm actually talking about is like when I'm doing my live gig, I have my saxophone preparations, and in some of them lower the pitch by a couple of octaves. And what comes with that too is that the volume is also softer. And sometimes musicians they they see it and they understand that I'm doing something different, and they understand that there's this unusual sound. So they're responding to the idea of it and not to the subtlety of the sound of it. So I have to make, so sometimes I have to make that adjustment. In many instances with certain preparations, I might only play it for a minute or two, only because I'll start playing it, and then the musicians aren't coming down volume wise so that it can come through. And I'm like, okay, I'm not able to get to, what I intended to. So I have to adjust. So I'm not sure if I answered your question.
No, no, this is really great because you're as we're talking, right? And I'm listening to your answers and stuff like that. And just like you said with Jean-Michel, like I was expecting a particular answer, but no, you went somewhere different with it, which is really interesting and really cool. And it makes me think to myself too, we have students, musicians, our peers, colleagues, whatever. One great tip you've already given is that, and I know this too, and I know I have to do this more myself, but my trumpet teacher, Vince Penzarella, always said, record yourself, record yourself. The
Yeah,
recorder doesn't lie. But it's this energy thing that you said where you don't necessarily need to replicate that live energy when you're recording, because that may not be the thing that you want to do in that situation. You have to think about the situation that you're in.
yeah,
And it made me think also, though, that for a lot of people that are so used to recording themselves for YouTube, for TikTok, for Instagram, then when they go out live, it's an adjustment. And
yeah,
so far, we're talking about a lot of adjustment, right? Everything's been adjustment, and vice versa, too. It's an adjustment. And it's not just a physical adjustment, it's a mental adjustment, too. It's an
yeah.
emotional adjustment.
Absolutely. I mean, when I think about, the difference between a stage actor and someone who mainly does film, it's very, they're both acting, utilizing all of the techniques, but, what they have to exert is very different. It's a very different energy, on stage. It's like there's more to lose. When you're on stage. When you're filming, it's like, okay, they might film that particular scene, like 20 times in a row, and then edit it together. But there is no editing live, so there's just a certain uh, uh, you know there's a sense of urgency, that one has to deal with, when they're performing live, that they don't necessarily have to deal with when they're in the recording studio. And yes, it is something very different, and it's, we have to think of those, that the energy that required for both as being very different. It's not, they're just, I don't say they don't have anything to do with each other, but you have to deal with the situation. You have to give the situation what it requires.
And even going off of what you're saying right now too, and you said this before, and this is so true. You're in a recording studio. Usually the first take is usually the best because it's like, I don't know, it's just there is an energy about that, right? And then it's like, okay, let's do it again. Let's do it again, do it again, do it again. And after a while, yeah, all that the mental garbage starts to go in your head, and you're thinking, okay, is it because we're doing it again because it's not good enough? All right, maybe I need to rethink this part, or I need to rethink that part. Like all this stuff can happen too. And that, I know for me, that's a challenge. I'd prefer to be in front of a live audience and stuff, but
Mm.
like I've the first recordings that I ever did, like I'd get in the first shot and be like, okay, good, we're done. And be like, great. But I find for me, like keeping, I guess trying to have that beginner's mind, so to speak, bringing this back a little bit full circle, and looking at each moment, each take as a new moment, and a different thing to explore. I guess I'm giving myself my own advice or whatever and tips for everybody here, but that may be something that people can think about. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that when you're doing like multiple takes and stuff like that.
Yeah, the hardest thing is to treat each take as you know as the is to treat it as though you're doing it for the first time, and which is difficult when you're obviously not.
Yes.
So yeah, so it is a challenge, and I guess one of the things I do is I don't try to necessarily play great solos each time. Sometimes I'll say, well, the last take I was kind of notey, so let me leave more space, on this particular take, or the last take, maybe I was playing in a way that was more abstract. So maybe I'll play more melodic. Maybe I'll stick to the melody more. I just try to make very deliberate choices, rather than being totally spontaneous. I let as you talked about earlier, let my creativity come from the limitations. So that's one of the ways I'm able to do multiple takes and have each of them, have its own beauty of being in the moment.
And going off of this, and the reason why I'm going into this topic of like, recording versus live and then multiple takes with this album, Cosmic Unconsciousness Unplugged, you guys did this in one take.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I can't even imagine like trying to do those things over. But I mean, some of those things I didn't even realize what we had recorded until after it was done. After we, whatever, we finished the recording session, and then maybe a week later, I listened back and I was like, oh wow, that was nice. It's like I didn't really know what we recorded. It was just kind of like we were the way it was put together is a little bit different from how we recorded it. I mean, we pretty much played four basically 20-minute sets. We would just start playing, and usually after 20 minutes, it just felt good. It just felt like, okay, it kind of had this natural arc. We would kind of start here, and then it's like, okay, that felt like the end of the first set. And then we would just, take a little break, talk a little bit, and then we would do another one. And then we just did that over the course of several hours. And then what happened when we put it together, I would think about how to, program the recording, so I would say, oh, well, I like the first sort of musical thing we got to for the first set. And I think maybe we'll take the last musical moment from the third set. We'll put that second, then we'll take the third musical moment from the second set. It was sort of that way. So the way that it came off on the recording, it wasn't. We didn't just make. We didn't just record that album, and it just came out at this fully formed work. It was a series of sets that we recorded, and then we just sort of cut and paste and put those. I call them musical moments because at the time they weren't really songs, and just sort of put them together, you
wow.
know, to make that the recording.
Okay, that's really interesting. And this goes back to not only that, again, that Suzuki comment about, beginner's mind and stuff like that, but also your book. And one
Hmm.
of the main points that I brought out about, and I wanted to bring this out before, but not going into a situation with expectation. Because when you go into a situation with expectation, you could be let down and
Yeah,
it's not
absolutely.
always going to come to fruition.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you usually just set yourself up for just like a great disappointment, and it's not just in when you're playing, just in life in general. I mean, you just kind of have to just sort of had that mindset, it is what it is, and it's going to be what it's going to be, and kind of like really, really believe that. And I know it's a very difficult thing, but I can certainly tell you from experience that your life becomes a lot less stressful, a lot less neurotic if you can just really just sort of, you know, just kind of surrender. I guess one of the things that like people who are religious, I guess one of the advantages they have, of course there's always this other dogma that surrounds religions that can be very destructive, but one constructive thing about religion is that it is that you're surrendering to a higher power, and so in some ways it just takes the burden off of you. It's just kind of just to think, well, it's in God's hands, and so it's just like, well, I mean, in some ways they're kind of saying the same thing that we've been saying as far as music, playing music. You you get out of the way of the music that wants to reveal itself, and sort of in their context, it's like, well, put it in God's hands and let God do his work. So and it's all about surrendering.
Yeah.
So so yeah, so I found, just if I can just sort of bring that practice into my daily life as well, it just makes things a lot easier. And I think that's one of the reasons too why I am able to improvise, because I do, live from that mindset, because I like what I'm playing, the way I play now, I could not do this 20 years ago. Not because of I didn't have the musical knowledge or technical facility. I may have had more technical facility, but I didn't have the mindset. I was a lot more neurotic. I was very paranoid. I was overly ambitious. I was certainly not an in the moment kind of person. I always went to the gig with an agenda. It's just like, whatever, you want to get the big applause, or, there's a certain competitive aspect to, at least then, there was a certain competitive aspect to my, that I had with the music, where you try to, maybe if there was another saxophonist, you try to outplay them. So, I'm guilty of that. So I didn't really have, that sense of inner peace that I have now. I don't think I would feel intimidated to be on the stage with anybody now. Not because I feel like I'm a great player, just because I've become very comfortable, in my own skin. That I don't feel necessarily inferior as a musician. I've learned to embrace my voice. I learned to embrace my limitations as well as my strengths. I played, numerous times with Dave Lieben. And 20 years ago, I would have been so intimidated just from the fact that he's played with Elvin and played with Miles and just all of these jazz greats. But now, I'm like, well, he's Dave Lieben. I respect that, and I admire it, and I embrace it. But then at the same time, I say, well, I'm also a person, and I have a set of life experiences that I'm also bringing to the table. It's just like a valid life is not just that of the celebrity. You can find a ordinary person off the street, someone who's, maybe who collects garbage for a living, or someone who delivers the mail, or someone who's a nurse, or who's a cashier at the grocery store. And they will have an amazing story. I mean, they'll be like amazing people. But their life and their experiences are not less profound or less valid or less important simply because they're not famous or because they don't have a lot of money or maybe they don't have the education, but they have the experience. They're living a life that is made up of having lived many days, many years, in having had a lot of experiences, that they can bring to the table. So I think so. The same thing happens musically, where you're, like we all sort of have our path that we've been traveling. So it's what we have to do is just learn to embrace that and not to look at it from a competitive perspective and think, oh well, that person is on the cover of Downbeat, so therefore their music is more valid. So we have a tendency, in this day and age to be so intimidated by someone's resume. What I always tell people to do is, like, what you should be more concerned with is how moved you are by their music. It's like, what do you get from hearing them play? It's not seeing, how many critics voted for them or how many gigs they have, but is anyone talking about them? Have you, like, if I've people have talked about, have come up to me sometimes. Yeah, I heard so and so won this or got this Grammy, and I'm like, oh really? How does their music sound? I'm not really sure. So we get so caught up in these other things, but I think our existence with music would be so much more fulfilling if we just got to the music. So it's like, let that inform our decisions or our feelings. It's just like, maybe getting like don't get in, like, sometimes we get intimidated by the publicity, but maybe if you got intimidated by the fact that they are playing in a way that's so profound, and just like, oh man, I really want to get to that. It's like, that should be what you're focused on, not the other things that we tend to let cloud our thinking.
Do you think, based on what you're saying right now, right, this is your older self, and there may be some younger people, listening to this podcast and that kind of thing. Do you feel, though, that when people are first coming onto the scene for themselves, that they have to go through that competitiveness, that they have to go through that shredding type of thing? Or do you think that they could, as long as, we're not saying don't practice. No, I mean, you have to work on your craft, but do you think that they need to go through the stuff that most of us go through? Or do you think that they could just have this mindset to start with?
I think you have to have a balance. You have to. It's like you get to it when you get to it. Like for me, I'm certainly a family man, and I love being a husband and a father. I love you know being a provider, but I wasn't there in my 20s, my 30s for sure. I just, my life was all about getting to the horn. So it's like, when I was like 26, if anybody asked me to take a baby to the park in a stroller, I was like, are you crazy? I got some practicing to do. I have time for that.
Yeah.
I was hard. I wasn't there. It's just like, I always tell my wife she should, it's good that she, agreed to marry me when she did, because had it been 10 years earlier, it would have been a very different experience. And I always think about that too, when people get married, like in a very young age. It's like, especially if they're like still just growing, it's just like, I can't even imagine just like someone being tortured, like being in a marriage with me, like when I was like 25 or 26. It's like my life was literally just about practicing and just clocking in my 4 or 5 hours a day. And, like I lived to just get better on the instrument. And that was a phase, a stage that I needed to go through. But I'm glad I did not involve anybody else in that process. But I guess to answer your question, but it would have uh, done me a lot of good. I think had I, been less competitive and maybe enjoyed the moments more, just enjoyed playing more. I mean, I would be, you know, uh, uh, like, traveling, going to different countries, playing on big stages, and being unhappy because I felt like, I wasn't getting, enough praise,
Mm.
by the jazz world. It's like
Yeah.
this total disconnect, but that was, but I felt, I would have gotten more out of it, had I maybe learned to have um, uh, just enjoy playing more. And I think I would have played better too. I mean, I've never told anyone about this, but it's one of my frustrations. I think when I was, especially playing with the Terrence Blanchard's group when I was playing tenor, was that I was always practicing, and I was practicing so much that um, my my fingers and joints would get stiff, and
Wow.
so I would go to the gigs, and then like maybe the first couple of hours, like when I was practicing during the day, things felt great, but I just kept going. And then by the time I got to the gig, it's just like my muscles were shot. And it's like I didn't I didn't play very well. And so I would come off the gig, think, oh man, I need to practice more. So you kind of keep that vicious cycle going. You just kind of keep working yourself into a hole. Whereas I would have played so much better had, I woken up and just had like a nice lunch, went for a walk, maybe I actually got out and saw a little bit of the country that I was visiting.
Oh, wow.
Like went to a museum, saw some of the monuments. I talked to some of the locals. Like I would have gotten so much more out of the situation, and I would have played better because I would have gone to the gig more relaxed. I wouldn't have strained my muscles so much, and I just think I would have just gotten a much better uh, had a much better experience playing. So that's one of the things when I think about my youth, like that's my one of my regrets is that I did devote so much time going for this thing that I didn't even really need. It's just like all of this technique and all of these ideas that I was trying to hone. At the end of the day, I didn't even really need it.
Wow.
It's like I didn't need that much technique. I didn't need that many ideas. What I needed was very simple. And so I was so now, you know, I'm still able to. I think just having put in so much time when I was younger, I do have a certain amount of facility on the instrument. But as far as the knowledge, I was like, I probably needed just like a a, a quarter of that stuff that I was actually working on. I probably could have gotten a lot more just out of just being in the moment and just improvising more, listening more, playing off of the ideas of the other musicians.
This is really profound. And the question that comes to mind, I think about again, our generations growing up, but also people growing up now. Let's say they were born in the year 2000, they were born in 2010, whatever, and always going for the likes, always going for the shares. always
Yeah.
going for the viralocity, as Brendan Burchard would say, right? Um, and how that's really affecting them, their mindset and stuff.
Yeah, it's hard to even imagine just for me being a young musician coming up and sort of having, dealing with these things being sort of at the beginning of my career. It's yeah. I mean, I think there's certainly a positive aspect to it, but I think if that's your ultimate goal, I think it's 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 very deceiving. It's like it's like you're you're going for something that doesn't really exist. It's all sort of fake. So it could be a dangerous thing if you nurture that, but yet you don't nurture sort of the live aspect of it. I'm really into to stand up comedy, and so I always hear stand up comics talk about this. They'll talk about these young up and coming comedians who have this TikTok following, or maybe they're big on Instagram, or maybe they have their little thing on YouTube or Facebook, but they have no skill set to be able to go onto a stage and command an audience
Mm.
for 30 or 40 minutes and kind of keep them laughing for the whole time. Like I guess they say with stand up comedy, I can't remember. I think you're supposed to maybe get a laugh. I don't know, like every I don't know, like 30 seconds or whatever, 40 seconds or something like that. I mean, it's sort of calculated in that way,
Huh.
but they don't really have that ability because they're so busy on nurturing this thing that has some validity, but at the end of the day, it's not anything of great substance. So I think for musicians too, like, okay, you can put together an interesting video that can get, a lot of likes on Instagram, but yeah, but can you, yeah, I guess you can have a big audience for 60 seconds or less, but can you do an hour long set and keep someone's attention? I think that is the true test, and so I think they have to sort of keep that in mind, that being able to entertain people for 60 seconds or less, there's something to that, because not everybody can. Not everybody can put up a video and have someone actually care about what they put up. So there is something to that, but then you have to be able to take it a step further, and to be able to actually give a full length performance.
That is a great analogy. And what's interesting, we've gotten into this topic, likes, all that kind of thing, and even reviews. And the cool thing, I mean, for you, so I'm holding up the latest Downbeat magazine with
Oh
Samara
yeah.
Joy on the cover. This is the January 2024 edition. And what was great is that they reviewed your album here, and they gave it a great review. And they basically said Cosmic Unconsciousness Unplugged is a set of free improvisations, all first takes. Even the four standards the duo explores are quite unpredictable, with nothing being worked out beforehand, and the tunes being taken to surprising destinations while keeping the melodies close at hand. I wanted to read that out loud because that was so true. Like when you did, and I'm going to do something totally different, folks, on this podcast. We're actually going to play some music from the album here. And like, for example, when you did Take the A Train,
Hmm.
and what I'm going to do for the video people, I'm going to be sharing the screen over here. This is the Bandcamp, and we'll put this link in the show notes. But this is the Bandcamp site over here with the album and stuff, where you could buy the album. But we're going to listen to a little bit of Take the A Train here, and um, the way like this started out was just so interesting. Just the way, again, it just started out. So let's take a little bit of a listen to this, and then we'll get some commentary from you afterwards about, like, what your thought process was when you were starting this, if you could remember that. I'm not sure,
Okay.
but
Sure.
going here. this over here. So much going on here, right? So you're starting off with like sparse statements, but it's obvious we can hear the melody.
Hmm.
When you were playing, if you could remember, what was in terms of like timing, in terms of like rhythm feel and stuff like that, was there anything that you were feeling in terms of that, or was it totally rubato? Like, how are you guys reacting to each other?
Well, I think we're feeling more of the space of time more
Mm,
so than the individual measures. Because if I went into a situation with John Michel and tried to count like one, two, three, four, like it would never work out. But when you sort of try to feel like a space of time, then there's so much freedom there. But then in a very miraculous way, you're always together. It's like you never lose each other. I mean, and that's one of the things too that I learned from actually playing with him of was was how to feel spaces of time versus trying to feel each individual measure or just the two and four because that I mean if you're but oftentimes when we learn jazz, they tell us, just focus on the two and four, and there is certainly a lot of validity to that. But I think if you only know how to feel music from that perspective, it's like you're going to be very lost when you're playing with someone like John Michel who knows how to feel like moments of time within the music, rather than thinking of one bar. Maybe they're feeling the entire section. They're feeling an A section, so you can sort of
mhm.
feel this sort of wave that you're riding for that entire section.
That's
So that's how we're able to have rhythmic liberties without it getting sort of convoluted in any way. So it's always it's together, but then it's not, but then it is.
yeah, that must be I just yeah, let me actually look at you for a second. Yeah, so that must be, gosh, how can one develop that? Like you said, you learned a lot from Jean Michel about that, but you couldn't have gone into that situation without, you know, having
Yeah.
some sense of that. Do you know what I mean?
Well, a lot of it too comes from me having played a lot of solo concerts.
Mm,
Because when
okay.
you're playing solo, you have to feel it in that way. Like you can't play solo and just for the whole time, you know, play from the mindset of one, two, three, four, two, two, three. I mean, that would be exhausting. So you have to feel music in a different way, So if I played that song, unaccompanied, it would be the exact same thing. I would feel sort of this kind of moments in time where I'm going from maybe my musical statement is not from bar to bar, but maybe it could be from section to section. Just like I'm sort of moving along the changes, in the sense of moving from here to here rather than from here to here to here to here from here to here. So it's more of I guess it's sort of like a more of a long distance run than a sprint. Than sprinting from measure to measure. I'm sort of like I'm sort of jogging or whatever from
Yeah.
section to section.
This is interesting because I see this from another point of view, and this reminds me when I was at Queens College and we took a course in Schenkerian analysis, and Carl Schachter was the teacher. He was the worldwide authority on this, and the idea was that there's levels of looking at music for the most part, and you could be in the weeds, looking at every single little thing. You could take that 5,000 foot view and you start to see bigger relationships, but then it's that like 30,000 foot view where you're dealing with the whole thing is about tension and release, right? So
Mm,
it's where's the really big tension, where's the spot in the piece that has the most tension, and where's the biggest release point, and then
mm.
you've got the other little release points and stuff like that, and that's what this reminds me of.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great way of putting it. I hadn't thought of that. But yeah, but it's the same concept, you know. As you said, I mean, I guess the being in the weeds would be like just thinking from change to change or from measure to measure. But I am sort of looking at it more from a distance.
Do you find that you have that approach of looking at it more from a distance with not just the solo concerts, but if you're playing with a group, or that's going to be something a little different? Do you know what I mean?
Now I do. I certainly not in my youth, and it was all measure to measure.
Yeah.
uh, but now, I think really just having played a lot of solo concerts and played a lot of improvised music gigs. That's kind of how I deal with music now. I mean, that's why when I play standards now, I'm so free with them. Just because I am seeing more of a bigger picture. I'm seeing more of the musical terrain than just sort of, as you said, getting inside the grass. So that's allowing me just to be freer with the material in many ways, rhythmically, harmonically. I mean, when I used to talk, when I said earlier, I used to practice all of these things that I had no use for. Uh, but now, what I'm actually discovering, because at least harmonically, because I am able to see a much bigger terrain, I have so much more freedom that I can pretty much use anything. I mean, I can take melodies from different tunes, make up progressions on the spot because it's less about sort of from measure to measure, but just kind of like just really just kind of make sure I resolve it at the end. It's just so it's almost like they say like there's no such thing as a wrong note, but only wrong resolutions.
Yeah.
So it's like I'm kind of operating from that perspective. And so, and that could be that could be a harmonic resolution, or it could be just a musical resolution. It could be something that's outside of harmony.
That's interesting. Can you expand upon that?
Yeah, well, I guess as far as a musical resolution, like let's say what we were doing was kind of like an example of that, where like maybe you might play the melody, maybe in a very loose way, and maybe you might even take some melodic or harmonic liberties. But if you can sort of bring it back home at the right moment, it makes all of the other stuff that was played before make sense. So that's the reason why you hear it. It's like, oh, they're playing Take the A Train. And that's the reason why you can hear the different sections because, there is a musical resolution that happened. Had there not been any musical resolution where maybe we were just sort of out there for the entire time, it might have been a very different kind of listening experience. It's just like with the way that we play, it's like sometimes you can snap your finger or sync fingers on two and four. Sometimes you can hear the melody, but it's kind of in and out. Whereas if it was just a melody, and then we were just sort of off to outer space, then it would be as I said, it would just be a very different type of uh, playing and listening experience. So again, yes, I think just musically speaking, just sort of having that kind of resolve, you know, doesn't necessarily have to be uh, from section to section, but just when the context of the whole piece, like it has to resolve somehow to where there are moments of clarity.
Yes.
And then once you have those moments of clarity, it's almost like you get recharged again, and then you kind of take it out or do whatever, you're taking your liberties, and then you come back, have your moment of clarity, and then you kind of keep it going.
That's what I felt listening to this. That's so interesting that you're saying it this way. That's really cool. And in fact, you know what I want to do? I want to ask about a moment of, well, the moment of clarity here. So we're still on Take the A Train over here. Um, I want to go towards the end
Mhm.
and how you, and maybe I'll go like that here. You feel the clarity right there. Right there. Okay, so first of all, after we talked and listened to this again, yeah, that's what I was feeling. Even the first time I listened to this, I'm like, you feel this build up, thing. You feel the release, you feel the build, you feel the release, you feel that. And what was really interesting, what made you decide to do like a multiphonic note as your ending resolution note?
I'm not even really sure. It just felt like the thing to do.
It was cool. It was very cool, and
It's like a type of, you might say, a sort of a sonic or musical punctuation that you have at the
mm,
end. It is not uncommon. I mean, it's something that I do a lot, and it's just like with that particular note, the D on the saxophone, like it can make a really cool multiphonic. So when I was playing that note, I was like, just move a finger here and there, and then I can get into a different sound.
and I know people are going to ask, be like, oh, I want to be able to do that. How do you do that? How do you do that? So I'm going to ask you that question. How does someone start to work on multiphonics?
Um, well, there are a lot of books out there that you can get. I'm so bad with names, but I think one book, the title of it is "Hello, Mr. Sax."
Okay, I'll
It's
write
by
that
one of
down.
those French composers, saxophonists. I mean, that's really like the encyclopedia of multiphonic because they have the fingerings for soprano, alto, tenor, and baritone.
Okay, okay,
So that's a good one. And then one of the things that you'll discover with multiphonics is, they're not always they don't always translate well from horn to horn. So you'll find there are certain ones that work best for your setup and certain ones that don't. And so it's really trial and error. But once you understand the logic of it, you can quickly start to devise your own set of fingerings.
almost like altissimo in a sense. I mean, altissimo, there's some standard fingerings so for some of the
Yeah,
notes, but from one horn to another, it's different. You
yeah.
know, that's the whole thing. So it's kind of along the same lines. That was really cool. Now let's do another one. I'm just thinking about ones like standards for a second. So I'm thinking about all the things you are, and what I'm going to ask about with this one, track number 3 over here. Um, Thinking about like the moments that are happening, and perhaps also maybe I don't know if you can remember, but just getting into the mindset of what went on when this happened. So let's go to here, all the things you are. Now I feel that moment of release right there. That's really cool. And again, like another moment of release there too. So, and I know this is Jean-Michel's playing and stuff like that, but
Yeah,
like he took it out, he
yeah,
took it
yeah.
out there for a second, and but it was still, it was really cool to listen to. And the thing that I noticed too, like ba da ba 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 da da ba 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 da da ba, like he's not just playing an idea and then going forward. It's sometimes he'll hit something and he'll just like develop it a little bit and that kind of thing. And as you're, I don't know if you remember being in the studio and stuff like that, like, you follow the melody, but you put, like that more 30,000 foot view approach to it and stuff like that. Um, but as you're listening to him and, thinking about, okay, so you're listening for the moments of release and all that kind of thing, and I guess wondering when you're going to come in. I'm wondering, you played a lot of solo gigs. Was it is it hard to adapt to having someone else on the stage uh in this kind of environment, so to speak, in this kind of free improvisation kind of environment?
Um, in the beginning, it was, but I think as I got more comfortable with my own playing and just playing with other people in general, it became easier, and it's also easier when you have the right people playing with you. If you have someone who's has the sensibility, to be able to respond, in an appropriate way to what you're doing. It doesn't uh, sort of hinder your thought at all. Meaning, like there's a certain flow that you have when you're playing solo, but then that flow can be this equal to that when you're playing in a dual context. If you have someone who knows how to support what you do, or who knows how to respond in a musically appropriate way that does not disrupt your flow. Like if I like the way John Michel was playing. If I was sort of forcing more of I don't know, maybe a strict bebop agenda on top of that or against that, there would be a musical clash. So if I'm sort of using ideas that I'm playing solo, with someone like John Michel, it's not that much of a musical compromise. Like, for example, one of the reasons why Take the A Train works, because I do play that solo, so I'm able to just take that same looseness that I would have when playing unaccompanied, and then I know that he knows how to respond in a way where he's not taking me out of that mindset, or taking me out of the type of loose approach that I'm bringing to the duo context.
Have you ever had an experience where you've performed with someone else, I guess I'll say, but even
Mhm.
I'm thinking two things here, actually. Let me ask the first question. Will you perform with someone else where they did take it really like out and it was hard to bring it back for you? Do you know what I mean?
Oh yeah, all the time.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, because like recently, I've been playing with a lot of younger improvisers. And the reason why I call them improvisers because there's like I don't know if I was going to say in New York, but it's all over the country. Maybe it's more. It could be more of a millennial thing where there's like just a group of young people who don't really identify as jazz musicians. They don't really identify as free jazz musicians. They call themselves improvisers. So because they play a lot of improvised music, experimental music. So I do play more recently quite a bit with those musicians, and I guess energy wise, sometimes they push it to the level where maybe I'm not used to going, at least not for the entire performance. So sometimes I'm having to get outside of my comfort zone and just kind of go with where the music is, at least where they're taking it. And sometimes I find myself getting to new just different ideas, just because I'm forced to play in a different kind of way. Yeah, so yeah, I all the time, I guess, like John Michel, because he's a seasoned jazz musician who's, you know, also, you know, a very good experimental player. At least he's a seasoned jazz musician who has a very strong experimental component to his playing. So I can get to certain subtleties and nuances that I can with him that maybe I can't get to with some of the younger musicians that I'm playing with. But that's fine too, and I accept that I'm not going to be able to get to those some of those things with them, and I just deal with what I can get to, with them. But I guess to answer your question, yeah, sometimes it will go in a way that's very much abstract and energetic, for like 40, 50 minutes straight, and it's just like for me, and I guess because of my traditional uh, uh, jazz background, I am used to tension and release, kind of call and response. But with them, it's more of it can be all tension and very little release. And it's not necessarily call and response, it's more of a cacophony of sounds
Wow.
are happening simultaneously. So you just kind of have to learn how to find your own little space within those cacophony of sounds. So yeah, so it's a very different approach. So I feel like I've grown actually by playing with them because it's what I do. What I have discovered is that I rarely have to give any notes. Like when I first started playing kind of improvised music, and I would use musicians who are for the most part jazz musicians. Always felt like I had to give notes at some point. It's just like, well, when I do this, maybe don't bow. Or if you hear me do this type of idea, like don't do this, just, at some point I want the energy to go high. Or at some point I wanted to come down. I would give like maybe a little bit of notes before we start, but I wouldn't say anything before, but just I would sort of paint sort of a picture of how I wanted the musical landscape to look throughout the performance. Because I felt like I needed to give them those directions, or else the music would get lost. There would be too many dead moments, where we're trying to figure it out, which can happen when you're playing improvised music with people who maybe don't know how to get around those dead moments. But with these sort of younger players, like they're never dead moments. So I never have to give notes. It's always just sometimes it's just me in some ways trying to keep up, just energy wise, or just trying to come up with uh, maybe enough unique sounds that I know how to 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 find my own little space, as I said before, within the cacophony of sounds that's going on around me.
Yeah, and you mentioned a couple things, but particularly like dead moments and stuff. And one question I have is like, let's say someone is, they're really intrigued by this and what you're doing and all that kind of stuff, and they want to do solo sax playing, right? No accompaniment, that kind of thing. How does one get started doing that? And as you're doing that, like, how do you avoid the dead moments?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I always tell people if you want to play solo, I wouldn't start off necessarily just doing evening length concert. I would integrate it, within your set, of playing with other people. Let's say you have a quartet gig. Maybe you would maybe start the gig off playing a solo piece. Maybe instead of doing sort of the standard ballad, that one sort of plays, in the context of the set, maybe you can do that solo, or maybe you can even do something duo. So it's like just so you can learn how to be comfortable with the space, because to be out there for 50, 60 minutes, it's a long time. I mean, like it could be like watching paint dry. you know, if you're not used to it, it's like you might look at your watch and think the concert's almost over, and you have like another 40 minutes to go. And it's like, and your reed has given out as well as your lip. So I've certainly have been in that situation. But now it gets to the point where I'm like, oh wow, is it over? So that's good, because it's like I'm learning how to just lose myself in the moment. And also what I've discovered too is playing solo. It's just like I learned how to make every moment a sonic moment. Like let's say I'm playing a melody and I'm just said, okay, I'm gonna go into something prepared. So which is an ordeal because I have to take off the mouthpiece and then I have to take this piece and I have to attach it to the sax and I have to put the mouthpiece back on. So you can imagine, if you're playing and you're trying to create this continuous flow of music for an hour, like that could be disruptive to kind of stop, take off the mouthpiece, put something on, put the mouthpiece back on. And then you figure you go into it, and then okay, now I have to stop, take the mouthpiece off, take the piece back off, so it's like this. So when I first started doing that, I was like, man, this is. I like I like the changeover, but as I'm changing over, that's the part that's bothering me. So I felt like, well, why don't I, you know, why do I have to make it so separate? So what I started doing was, I just make it all a part of this sort of sonic process. Like I would, like maybe take the mouthpiece off and maybe play that a little bit,
Mm.
and then maybe play the saxophone without the mouthpiece. And then while I'm doing that, maybe I put the mouthpiece down and then I pick up the tube extension. Maybe I play that for a little bit. I put that on, then I maybe play it without the mouthpiece, and then I pick up the mouthpiece and I'm playing that. And then I put the mouthpiece on, and then I'm sort of into this whole other thing now. So there are many different moments that I was able to take advantage of, just by learning how to deal with it on more of a micro level, rather than thinking, okay, I need to take this mouthpiece off, put this other piece back on and put the mouthpiece back on. So I learned how to really, just to make more of that process of changing over. So little things like that, you discover, that when I listen back to it, it's like sometimes those are the most interesting moments actually of the concert,
Huh.
because even for the listener, they're not sure what I'm doing, and I know where it's going, but they don't know where it's going. Like when I pull the mouthpiece off and I start playing the mouthpiece and then I play the horn without the mouthpiece, they don't really know where that's gonna go. And then next thing you know, I'm picking up this tube extension, then I'm playing that. They still don't know where it's gonna go. And then when I attach it, so there are this long sort of moment of anticipation.
And
That
tension.
yeah, exactly. So you learn how to, just sort of make the most out of the situation. And this is something I could never do. I never would have thought about if I was playing with someone else, because maybe while I'm making some type of change, transition, the band is playing. So I don't have to think about any kind of dead moment or uncomfortable silence, because maybe the piano player can take up that slack. But when it's just you're responsible for all things sonic. you know.
Yeah, yeah. Wow, this is so interesting. And as we wrap up, because this has been incredible, three things come to mind: the ability to adapt,
Hmm.
the ability to be flexible, and also to keep the flow.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
and it's so interesting to me too, because I've known you for a few years now, and from our first interview, but also reading your book, you are living what you're doing in your book. It's not like you just wrote a book, here's a book, read it. Okay. And then, I just do as I wrote, not as I do. No, you do what you wrote. You know what I mean? So
Okay.
it's, yeah, it's really profound. And again, I'm going to encourage people. We'll put the link in the show notes for your book as well, and also this album, because I think it is really fascinating. What what upcoming projects do you have? A possible live recording from your next concert, your next show, but aside from that, what other upcoming projects do you have?
Well, this might sound like a bit of a curveball, but but maybe not. I've been since COVID, I got really into fiction writing. And so as a result, I wrote a few things. I wrote a collection of short stories. So they all center around jazz figures.
Wow.
So there's they all take place in kind of musical situations. So I wrote a collection of short stories, and I was going this whole trying to go the route of trying to get an agent, a literary agent, that type of thing. But I don't really have the stomach for that. It was just it's too discouraging, and there are too many gatekeepers for that type of world where it's like everything, you have to hit beats at a certain point, and there's a certain format, and just for me it was just sucking out of all of the creativity and fun out of it. So I was like,
Mm.
well, I was like, well, maybe doing anything conventional is not me. Maybe that's just not my path. So I said, well, let me just self-publish it, and because I felt like, well, there is an audience for it, because I don't know if you like with the world of fiction, a lot of times you just have, of course, there are writers, who are writing these things, professional writers, but a lot of times their characters, tend to be writers. So the world tends to exist, around like writers writing about other writers. So I felt like, we need to diversify. It'd be great, like to have like stories that musicians can relate to, where people actually write about music and actually have them get the language correct. Because oftentimes when non-writers write about music, they just say things that musicians wouldn't say.
Yes. Yes.
Just like someone might be at a jazz club and like, oh man, those musicians were really beating those notes, like the drummer was rapping those skins, like musicians, they would just never say that, something like that.
Make
So
it.
yeah.
Right.
So I thought it'd be great, just to even have, something literary work out there where it's written with a certain authenticity as far as the language and also just the nuances of the characters. So um, I'm working on just trying to get that together, and the goal would be to release it in the fall. For the most part, they're done, but the whole collection is finished. But I'm just sort of sending them out to a few people, getting some feedback, and then just try to get it out there. And I guess the goal is kind of it's still going to be tied to music. I was toying with the idea of actually, because there are 15 stories, so I was thinking about writing 15 pieces to go along with it. So there would be the album. I'm thinking about calling it Storyville. So like a play on Sidney Bechet, in the fact that there's stories,
Yeah.
and so Storyville, and then you would sort of have this album, that's sort of influenced by the story and the character, and I would just try to release both of these things together, and then I would also, I know this is a long answer,
Oh, no, this is great.
but I was gonna once it's out, just kind of do it in a very indie way, like call up independent bookstores, see if they would carry the books, and then offer to come in and play. So it would be a type of thing where I would promote the book and have a concert working simultaneously, and I could do it with people or I can do it solo. So that's sort of the next sort of bigger project that I'm trying to bring to fruition.
That's awesome. Let me ask you something. When you were writing, when you were in the actual process of writing, were you approaching writing this the same way that you approach music? So was it a free form type of improvisation coming out, or did you have a structure to it?
Oh, very good question. Uh, well, I guess in the fiction writing world, I guess they say there are two types of writers. They have the people they call the plotters, people who plot out every aspect of the story, the outline. And then they have people that they call the pantsers, a take on, writing by the seat of your pants, you know. Well, I quickly discovered that I'm a pantser.
Yeah.
So pantsing, if there is such a word, it works great for short stories because you can create a vibe. It's almost like what John Michelle and I did with the album. It's like some tunes would be like 3 minutes, and within 3 minutes you can kind of get in there, create a vibe, and then kind of get out. With writing short stories, the same type of thing. Like you can kind of get in there, you can kind of create a vibe, and then you can kind of get out. And you don't really have to plot it out. But when you're writing a novel, that's a little more of an intricate process. I did try to pants a novel, and I was less successful at that. It requires a lot more uh, techniques than I have at the moment, or not even techniques that I don't have, but just even having the patience to go through that. There's something about outlining a novel that I feel for me, it was just knowing how it's going to end would make me not want to write it.
Oh, wow,
You know
interesting,
what I mean? Like,
interesting.
with the great thing about writing short stories is like I have no idea where it's going to go. I have no idea of where it's going to end, and that's what makes me want to keep going at it every day until I finish it. Because it's like there's this unknown that I'm discovering, and it's like with music, you know.
Yeah, I was just about to say it's like how you approach the music. So it only makes sense that you're approaching that way. That is so cool. I'm so happy for you, and I hope that you're able to get this put out there. And I'm sure you're gonna have your book, storytellers or whatever it's gonna be called. But I'm sure you're gonna have it on your website and stuff like that, and
Oh,
probably
yeah,
bringing it to
absolutely.
shows and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I mean, I'm happy that for the most part, I think the jazz audience, the jazz world in general, I think they're readers. So I mean, they tend to be, I mean, for better or worse, part of the intelligentsia. So I think that I certainly feel like I would have a built-in audience for this, and it's not something that's been done to death. There are a lot of books about technique. There's a lot of books about the history of jazz. There's a lot of books about whatever jazz biographies about jazz figures, but I think there's very little fiction written about jazz musicians, especially by jazz musicians.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure.
Well, I think it would be very interesting. I'm very excited to see how it's going to be received. So, but I have to do my homework just as far as just even learning about that world of just like promotion and trying to get it into the right places, or just even having a creative way of promoting it. So it's, I mean, you know, and I'll definitely you're on my short list of people to get it to.
Oh, no, that's awesome. And yeah, we're going to talk a little bit. I'm just writing a note down for myself, creative ways of promoting. No, absolutely. But listen, you've been so generous with your time, Sam. I can't thank you enough. Where can people find you, find the album, your socials? Tell us.
Yeah, well, you can go to my website, somenewmusic.com. I'm getting better about updating. uh, Certainly in my blog, Soprano Sax Talk. I'm usually keep a lot of things there, and also I write various articles, just fewer things about the saxophone. Actually, it's just more about the creative process. A lot of times that I write about, that I usually post there. Um, I'm on Instagram a lot. I think it's Newsome 6518. And I think with that, if you want to just check out just the latest sort of experiments that I'm working on, like whenever I discover something new, I'm working on an idea, I usually always post it on Instagram just to sort of almost like a test marketing, just to see how people like it, get some feedback. So, that's sort of a good way to find out. So at least what I'm working on musically.
That's awesome. Well, listen, Sam, I can't thank you enough for your time. It was great catching up, and I'm going to be so interested about this fiction book of short stories. Congratulations.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it. And thanks again for your time too. I mean, you've been very generous and just very supportive. I can't thank you enough. I have to thank Jaleel Shaw for actually kind of making the introduction, right?
That's right. Oh my gosh. Yeah, it's been a minute. Yeah, because the last time you were on the podcast, I think it was 2021 or something like that. I can't believe it's so funny with COVID. Like we seem to have lost. I didn't think that would happen to me, but it has. I've lost track of time.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So true. So life is short. I mean, it seems like a cliche, but it's so true. Just it's like a blink.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this was an awesome blink right here. So again, thank you so much.
Great, my pleasure.